The South African Revenue Service says that the persistent power cuts in the country at the moment have costed up to 60 billion rand. That's in taxes. Sars Commissioner Edward Kieswetter said this while appearing before Parliament yesterday. Well, let's get more on that calculation with the Commissioner. Edward Kieswetter joining us on News at Prime tonight. A very good evening to you, sir. Thank you so much for being with us. Let's begin with how you've worked out or calculated the figure of 60 billion.
Good evening, Tabikile. The 60 billion that we mentioned is a preliminary estimation, and we believe that, in fact, the actual losses would be much higher. So what are the drivers behind these losses? Firstly, the CSIR reports that there were over 6,400 gigawatt hours that was not generated by Eskom in what they call unserved energy. Now, if you just take the cost of that, apart from the downstream effect of factories that can't operate, businesses that close, or any other loss of economic activity, they estimate that to be 560 billion rand impact on the economy. A very broad extrapolation of that, we have a tax to GDP ratio of about 25% in South Africa. And so if you do a coarse interpretation, you can see that, in fact, the impact on the fiscus is at least a quarter of that. Now, we are using 60 billion as a conservative estimate for a number of reasons. Firstly, there's a lag effect on what happens in the economy and what happens to tax revenue. Let me give a few examples. Firstly, if in any given year there is a loss of production or a loss of sales as a result of load shedding, that would have an immediate impact, an in-year impact on companies' performances, which would obviously have an impact on their profits and therefore an impact on the corporate taxes that they would pay. Secondly, in a shorter cycle, we would find that if there's loss of sales or loss of consumption, it would have an immediate impact on VAT. For example, if you don't, every product that is sold, there's 15% VAT added to that. So you can imagine if some of that economic activity or the RAND impact is the 560 billion, if some of that is loss of sales or consumption, there's obviously the net effect, and that between input cost and sales, which brings about the time lag. Now, we mentioned that, and then also we have to add back electricity that is self-generated. So many of the electricity gigawatts that is lost because of load shedding, there is an increasing, and we see that, and I'll come to that in a moment, there's an increasing subsector growth of people who are now importing equipment such as solar panels, such as inverters or lithium-ion batteries to provide a percentage of self-generation. That in itself, has an impact in the following way. Firstly, if goods are brought into the country, there's duties paid on goods that are imported. Secondly, some of that recovers some economic activity, and that economic activity would have a downstream effect on corporate taxes, on VAT, on company taxes. And so you can see there are pluses and minuses. There is an unintended consequence of a new subsector that's emerging. For example, we see that just in renewables, we have a 73% year-on-year increase in the importation of solar panels. Last year, that amounted to an import value of 3.8 billion. In terms of static converters, we saw a 609% improvement or growth totaling over 5 billion rand. And then lastly, lithium-ion batteries. And these are just reporting the top 10 importers, not the total value. we saw an increase of 240% or a value of 7.8 billion. And so you can see there's an unintended consequence which has a positive effect. Downstream, when some of those activities that are zero rated for VAT or because of there are input costs into additional electricity production, downstream when windmill farms comes into production, you will have a positive impact on taxes.
Right.
And so when we take the pluses and the minuses, we say conservatively at least 60 billion has been lost to the fiscus, but it could be much higher, as I pointed out, on a tax to GDP ratio of 25%.
How much higher do you think it might be? And I'm asking that especially in the context of what your Chief Revenue Officer warned about yesterday, the fact that we're likely to see the lag, which you too have referenced tonight, especially in corporate taxes.
Well, we think it can be as high as 160 billion. But we, as I said, we are doing more research and also trying to understand the time lag effects between what happens in the economy and what finally happens in the fiscus. Remember, we also have had last year the highest ever loss of electricity production due to load shedding. And the real concern we've expressed yesterday was we think that the impact this year will be even more severe.
And these are important projections and calculations because it's not just a loss for the revenue service, because what you are unable to collect is ultimately a loss for the country. And we see that in where some of these funds are supposed to go to as SARS development and assisting even, in some cases, the poorest South Africans.
And that's exactly the point that I think South Africans must understand, that a loss to the fiscus means government has less money to provide social services, to employ teachers, doctors, nurses, etc., to bring in medical supplies for public hospitals. It has limited means to provide additional social grants. We know there's a huge pressure on social grants being extended, even if it is just the social relief of distress grants. But then also the additional revenue, the minister, to his credit, have used this revenue to take off some pressure by paying off some debt, which also means reducing the debt service cost frees up some money and reduces the impact on borrowing, and that has a long-term impact. So it is complex, but I think it is safe to say that any impact of load shedding. I remember, Tembekile, as a young power station manager at our monthly meeting, we had this joy of seeing a perfect correlation between growth in electricity generation and growth in the economy. There was almost a perfect correlation. Mm-hmm. And so you can imagine if the growth in electricity production slows down, as it has in South Africa, there is a direct impact immediately on the economy, and it will have a lingering effect over multiple years.
And with that in mind, then, I'd imagine SARS is among the various other agencies and even citizens who are desperate to see the power cuts crisis, in fact, put to an end as soon as possible, so that you are able to, in your role, be able to then collect as much revenue as possible without losses that people and businesses are themselves unable to prevent at this stage.
Well, exactly. I mean, SARS itself just has had to put in its own supplementary power supply. Just in diesel, last year we spent, I think, in the order of 50 million rand just on diesel. We are now looking at solar and with that batteries and inverters so that we can provide business continuity at. Can you imagine if the payment system of South Africa, which is the daily payment and collection of taxes that funds the National Revenue Fund, can you imagine if that comes to an end and all payments grind to a halt, the huge cash flow impact that would have, not just on South Africa, but it would effectively bring government to a standstill.
How nervous does it make you from a revenue collection perspective and an operational level as someone who's responsible for SARS to hear that, in fact, in the next, 1, 2 months, 3 months, in fact, the situation is going to get worse because of winter and higher demand for power?
Becoming nervous is unhelpful.
How worried then are you?
We are concerned. And I think as the Revenue Authority, we look consistently at what additional measures we can impose, firstly, for business continuity, so that the national payment system into that feeds, it is as if you were the oxygen, the veins that supply the oxygen via the bloodstream to the various parts of our economy. So that's the first thing. We want to make sure we work with the banks, we work with the Reserve Bank, we work with the national payment system to ensure that that system continues to work so that the flow of funds can continue without any business interruption. And so we're making a huge investment in infrastructure. Secondly, we want to make sure that our own platforms on which we serve taxpayers, every time a submission, a file has to be submitted, every time when it is due, when a payment is due, every time when a registration is due, every time when a taxpayer walks into our offices, we have to ensure that our operating system remains available on a 24/7 basis because we are digital, largely digital these days. So yes, to your point, we remain concerned, but also we want to give the assurance to South Africans that from our perspective, we will leave no single stone unturned to ensure that the operating system of SARS that engages between us businesses and taxpayers, as well as the payment system of the country, remains operable throughout.
A concerned but not nervous Edward Kieswetter, Commissioner for SARS. Thank you so much for your time as always.